Welcome back, dear adventurers, to another soothing chapter of 9 Lives, a Felidian Tale. I'm your host, Owen, and I'm thrilled to have you with us once again as we journey through the magical world of Felidia. This podcast is your peaceful escape, a calming bedtime story designed to help you unwind and drift into a restful sleep. Before we begin, I want to thank you all for your continued support and your love for this tale. It's your excitement and curiosity that breathe life into these characters and their adventures, and I'm so glad we can share this journey together. In our last chapter, Finn and his companions ventured deeper into the mysterious forest, grappling with the strange resonance that's been haunting them. With the help of Brightpaw, Finn began to master the art of moving through the woods unnoticed. Meanwhile, Lyric and Willowshade worked together on a powerful spell, hoping to silence the eerie sound that's been following the group. But as they moved under the cover of silence, the wolves were watching, waiting for their moment. Tonight, the adventure continues as Finn and the others set their sights on an ancient outlook high in the mountains, where they hope to uncover the source of the resonance and find the answers they've been searching for. So, find a comfortable place, settle in, and let the rhythm of the story guide you toward a restful slumber. Take a deep breath, relax, and let's begin. Chapter 11, The Silent Ascent. The first rays of dawn stretched lazily over the camp, casting the forest in a soft golden hue. The air was still cool, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth, as the trees swayed ever so gently in the early morning breeze. Finn, lying in his bedroll, blinked his eyes open, feeling the familiar warmth of the morning light on his face. He stretched slowly, savoring the quiet moment before the day truly began. Around him, the others were already stirring. Thornwhisker stood near the remnants of the campfire, his large form casting a long shadow across the clearing as he meticulously inspected his gear. His fur, dark and battle-worn, seemed to catch the light in places where old scars peeked through. Nearby, Willowshade moved gracefully between the trees, gathering herbs and tending to her satchel of supplies. Her grey fur shimmered in the dappled sunlight, her movements as calm and steady as the forest itself. Lyric, ever the lively one, sat by the tree line, quietly tuning his lute. Today, though, there was no playful tune, no soft melody drifting through the air. His usual bright demeanor was tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. He glanced at Finn and offered a small smile, but even that seemed more subdued, like the final notes of a song fading into silence. Finn sat up, pulling his knees to his chest as he watched his companions prepare. There was a hushed anticipation hanging over the camp, as if even the birds and trees knew that today would be different. His own heart beat a little faster as he thought of what was to come. They would be traveling to the Outlook, testing the limits of a spell that none of them were entirely sure they could control. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. He rose to his feet, brushing off the leaves and dirt that had clung to his tunic overnight. His hand instinctively went to the camouflaging cloak folded neatly beside his bedroll. Finn's fingers ran over the rough, earthy fabric, feeling the comforting weight of it in his hands. He had carried this cloak with him for days now, its magic blending him into the surroundings whenever he needed to disappear. But today, he had a feeling he might need it more than ever. "Ready, lad?" came Thornwhisker's voice, deep and steady. The older warrior's amber eyes met Finn's across the campfire. Thornwhisker had a way of speaking that could calm even the most anxious hearts, and today was no exception. Finn nodded, standing a little taller. "As ready as I'll ever be." Thornwhisker gave a brief nod, satisfied with the answer, before turning to the others. "We'll be heading out soon," he said, his voice carrying easily through the morning air. "Lyric, Willowshade, remember, once the spell is cast, there'll be no room for error. Silence is everything." Lyric, ever quick with a grin, simply strummed a soft, barely audible chord on his lute. "Don't worry," he said, his voice unusually calm. "We've got this." But Finn noticed the way Willowshade's violet eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze flicking to the horizon. She said nothing, simply nodding in agreement, but Finn could sense the underlying tension in her stance. She was the steady heart of their group, the one who could heal with a touch, who seemed to understand the forest as if it were an extension of herself. but even Willowshade was cautious today. Finn pulled the cloak around his shoulders, feeling its magic settle over him like a second skin. The fabric seemed to hum softly, shifting and blending with the colors of the trees and earth around him. It was a small comfort, a reminder that he had grown since arriving in this strange, enchanted world. He wasn't the same unsure boy from days ago. He was part of the group now, a thread woven into the fabric of their adventure. As he adjusted the cloak, Brightpaw appeared at his side, his golden fur catching the light. "Nervous?" the scout asked quietly, his sharp green eyes sparkling with amusement. "A little," Finn admitted, unable to help the small smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth. Brightpaw had a way of making even the most serious situations feel like just another day's work. "You'll be fine," Brightpaw said, giving him a reassuring nudge with his shoulder. "Just stick close to me and remember what I taught you. The forest always talks. You just have to listen." Finn nodded, his mind flashing back to the previous days of training, of learning to move silently through the underbrush, of tracking animals and sensing the subtle shifts in the air. Today he would need every bit of that training. Thornwhisker stood tall, glancing over the group with the practiced eye of a seasoned leader. "We move out in 10 minutes. Get yourselves ready." Finn felt a flutter in his stomach, but it wasn't fear. Not really. It was something else, something deeper, a sense of purpose. This was more than just another day in the forest. Today they would get closer to the source of the resonance, closer to understanding what was drawing the wolves, and closer to whatever mystery lay beyond the tree line. As the others finished their preparations, Finn made his way to Willowshade, who was gently crushing herbs between her fingers, releasing their calming scent into the air. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice soft and melodic, like the wind through the trees. "I think so," Finn replied, though his heart still raced. "I'm just ready to find out what's really happening." Willowshade gave him a small, knowing smile. "You've come a long way, Finn. Just trust in yourself and in us. We'll face whatever comes together." He nodded, her words settling over him like a warm blanket. Together. That was the key. Whatever they found today, whatever dangers or mysteries awaited them, they would face it as a group, as friends. With one last deep breath, Finn gathered his things, his heart steadying as he glanced around at his companions. They were ready, and so was he. With the camp packed and the last of their preparations made, the group gathered at the edge of the clearing. Thornwhisker, standing tall and resolute, looked to Lyric, giving him a silent nod. This was the moment they had been preparing for. The spell needed to be cast, and once it was, the forest, usually alive with the soft hum of life, would fall into an unnatural silence. Lyric took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the neck of his lute. He plucked a few soft notes, each one resonating quietly in the still air, before he began to sing. His voice was low and melodic, weaving through the space between them, wrapping around the group like a protective cloak. Slowly the spell took shape, and the familiar sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, even the faint whistle of the wind, began to fade. Finn felt the shift immediately. The moment Lyric's voice filled the air, it was as if the entire world had taken a deep breath and held it. The spell of silence wrapped around them, creating a barrier that muted not just their own movements, but the sounds of the forest itself. Finn glanced at Willowshade, who gave him a calm, reassuring look as she placed her hand over her heart, reminding him to focus, to stay centered. They stepped forward as one, leaving the clearing behind, the familiar crackle of twigs and leaves beneath their feet now replaced by an unnerving quiet. Finn's footsteps, though careful, made no sound. The sensation was strange, disorienting even. The more they moved, the more he realized how much he had relied on sound to ground him in the world. Without it, everything felt distant, as if they were walking in a dream. Ahead of him, Brightpaw moved like a shadow, his golden fur blending with the soft light filtering through the trees. His steps were impossibly light, his eyes constantly scanning the path before them. He had warned Finn before that the forest was always talking, but now, with the silence pressing in on all sides, the forest seemed utterly still. No whispers, no rustles, just the oppressive quiet of the spell. They moved in a tight formation, each step measured and deliberate. Thornwhisker was at the front, his strong frame cutting through the underbrush, though even his heavy footfalls were swallowed by the silence. Willowshade followed close behind, her violet eyes sharp and focused, her hand occasionally brushing against the pouches on her belt, as if ready to draw on her magic at a moment's notice. Finn, walking between Lyric and Brightpaw, felt his senses heighten in the absence of sound. Every breath, every shift of the air around them felt magnified. He could feel the weight of the silence, pressing down on his shoulders, making the world around them seem smaller, more fragile. He glanced at Lyric, whose lips still moved in a silent song, the magic flowing from him in steady waves. The spell was holding, but Finn could see the strain beginning to settle in his friend's face, the faint lines of exhaustion, the tightness around his eyes. They moved deeper into the forest, and the landscape began to change. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisting together overhead to create a canopy that blocked out much of the light. Shadows danced across the ground, shifting and bending as the group moved, their forms blending with the darkened woods. It was a place that might have once felt serene, even beautiful. But now, in the silence, it felt like they were walking through a world just on the edge of waking, where something waited beneath the surface. Finn's heart beat faster as they continued. The quiet was unnerving, but it was more than that. It was the sense of being watched. Every now and then, he would catch a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision, a shadow shifting between the trees. He knew it was the wolves lingering just beyond their sight, but there was no way to hear them, no way to gauge how close they were. Only Brightpaw's sharp glances and subtle hand signals gave any indication that the wolves were nearby. At one point, Brightpaw raised a hand, signaling for them to stop. The group froze, each of them lowering into a crouch, their eyes scanning the dense underbrush. Brightpaw knelt, placing his hand against the earth, his nose twitching as he took in the scents around them. His green eyes narrowed, and for a long moment, he simply listened, not with his ears, but with his instincts. Finn held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He scanned the trees around them, his own ears straining to catch any sound, but of course there was nothing. Just the silence, just the stillness. After a few tense moments, Brightpaw gave a subtle nod and gestured for them to continue. The tension in Finn's chest eased, but only slightly. The wolves were still out there, watching, waiting, and while they might be hidden by the silence for now, Finn had the uneasy feeling that it wouldn't be enough to keep them safe forever. They pressed on, the terrain growing more difficult as they neared the outlook. The forest floor sloped upward, and rocky inclines replaced the soft earth they had been walking on. Finn's muscles burned as he climbed, but he kept his focus on the spell, making sure his steps were careful, deliberate. He couldn't afford to break the silence now. Ahead, Thornwhisker reached the top of the ridge first. He motioned for the others to follow, his amber eyes scanning the horizon as he stood tall against the backdrop of the rising sun. One by one, the group ascended the ridge until finally they stood at the edge of the stone outlook. The moment their feet touched the cool, solid stone, the feeling was immediate. The resonance weakened, its oppressive presence lifting like a weight from their chests. Finn exhaled slowly, realizing just how tense he had been, how tightly he had held his breath for fear of making a sound. They dropped the spell in unison, the silence breaking like a dam. The familiar sounds of the world returned in a rush, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant calls of birds, the whisper of the wind through the trees. Finn could have sworn even the forest seemed to sigh in relief. Lyric, exhausted from maintaining the spell for so long, dropped to his knees, panting heavily. Finn knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You all right?" Lyric nodded weakly, offering a tired smile. "Just need a moment." Thornwhisker stood at the edge of the outlook, gazing out over the landscape below. His jaw was set, his eyes hard with focus as he took in the sight before them. Finn followed his gaze, his heart still pounding as he realized they had made it. But what they saw was unlike anything they had expected. The outlook itself was a rune-covered stone structure, its surface etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the early morning light. The building reminded Finn of a lighthouse from his world, a solid structure standing high up on the mountain, its presence both reassuring and strange in such a remote place. The outlook stone was worn but unyielding, built to endure time's passage and the elements' fury. At the top, there was an encasement, a viewing platform that offered a full view of the mountain and the valley below, though they hadn't ventured up to it yet. It was a relic, Finn thought, like the shrines they had passed along the way, meant as a safe refuge for travelers. Wards were etched into every stone, layers of ancient magic woven through the structure. These places, built long ago, were beyond the group's understanding of magic. Yet the protection they offered was real. The oppressive hum of the resonance had lifted the moment they stepped onto the stone. Finn looked at the runes and thought about how these structures had been built for protection, not just from physical threats but from magical ones too. The wards here were different. They seemed to have a specific warding from the sound, something more powerful and ancient than anything they could replicate. Thornwhisker, ever practical, had already begun studying the valley below, but Finn's eyes lingered on the building for a moment longer, feeling the history embedded in the stone. These places were more than just shelters. They were legacies of a world long past. When Finn turned his attention to the valley below, his heart skipped a beat. Below them, where there should have been a vast, serene lake reflecting the sky, was something altogether different. Something broken, something wrong. The lake was still there, but most of its water was gone, drained away, leaving behind a jagged, desolate basin. Only a small amount of water remained, swirling unnaturally in mid-air, as though it were caught in the grip of an invisible force, twisting and turning in spirals around a central point. The water did not flow naturally. It hovered, suspended, bound by the strange resonance that now felt weaker, but still thrummed faintly in the air. Finn's eyes followed the path of the swirling water, watching as it seemed to stretch and bend, feeding into the rivers that flowed out of the lake and into the distant forest. It was as if the water itself was being drained away by the sound, stretched thin and unnaturally held before it finally escaped into the rivers below. At the center of the drained lake stood a small, rocky island, and on that island stood a tree, ancient and twisted, its roots reaching deep into the cracked earth below. The tree's bark was dark and gnarled, as though it had been there for centuries, weathered by time and the elements. Its branches, heavy with tangled vines, stretched out over the island like the skeletal arms of some long-forgotten creature. And hanging from one of those branches was an ornate bell. It was larger than Finn had imagined, its surface carved with intricate runes that glowed faintly in the weak morning light. The bell swayed gently in the breeze, though no sound came from it now. Instead, it seemed to hum with a low, constant resonance, a vibration that Finn could feel in his bones. The sound was maddeningly soft, barely noticeable at this distance, but it was there, like the faintest whisper at the edge of hearing. And it was clear now. This bell, this ancient relic, was the source of the sound that had been haunting the forest. But that wasn't all. Directly in front of the bell, suspended in mid-air as if frozen in time, was a shard, a glowing, crackling fragment of pure energy. It was purple, its edges sharp and jagged, pulsing with a deep electric light. The shard looked as though it had been launched from the sky, hurled with incredible force, and had been stopped at the last possible moment, just inches from striking the side of the bell. Finn's breath caught in his throat. The shard hung there, motionless, mere inches away from the bell's surface. The two forces, bell and shard, seemed locked in a silent, deadly standoff. The resonance, which now thrummed from the bell, was holding the shard at bay, preventing it from making contact. It was as if the bell's sound was the only thing stopping the shard from striking, the only thing holding back whatever terrible power it carried. The light from the shard flickered, casting long shadows over the drained basin, and Finn felt a deep sense of unease settle over him. This shard, it was dangerous. He didn't need Willowshade's magic to tell him that. He could feel it in the air, the way the hairs on the back of his neck stood up, the way his heartbeat quickened just by looking at it. The shard was alive with energy, ready to explode the moment it touched the bell. But the bell was stopping it, keeping the destruction at bay with its constant hum. "What is that?" Finn whispered, his voice barely audible. Willowshade, her eyes locked on the scene below, shook her head slowly. "The bell is holding the shard," she said, her voice laced with awe and concern. "It's keeping it from striking, from releasing whatever power it holds. The resonance. It's keeping it in place." Finn swallowed, his gaze fixed on the glowing shard. Lyric, standing beside him, let out a low whistle. "Looks like we found the source of all that noise," he muttered, though his usual humor was absent. There was nothing funny about what they were seeing. Thornwhisker, ever the practical leader, was silent for a long moment, his sharp eyes studying every detail of the scene below. The drained lake, the twisted tree, the bell, and the shard. He took a deep breath, his hands gripping the hilt of his sword, though he didn't draw it. "It's dangerous," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "Whatever that shard is, it's being held back by the bell. If the sound stops, if the resonance fails, the shard will strike," Willowshade finished, her voice soft but firm. "And whatever it's holding back will be released." But there was something else. On the island near the twisted tree there was a figure, a person. Finn squinted, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make out the figure's details. They were standing near the bell, their back to the group, their form cloaked in shadow. The figure stood perfectly still, as if they had been standing there for hours, unmoving. They seemed small, almost frail in the distance, but there was something unnerving about the way they were positioned. So close to the bell, so close to the shard. Who is that?" Finn whispered, his heart beating faster now. The presence of the figure added a new layer of unease to the already strange and dangerous scene. Thornwhisker narrowed his eyes, his grip tightening on his sword. "I don't know," he said slowly, his voice full of caution. "But they've been there for a while." The figure didn't move. They stood at the edge of the bell, their head tilted slightly as if they were listening to the faint hum of the resonance. The soft purple glow of the shard cast their shadow long over the rocky island, but even from this distance, Finn could feel something was off. The figure wasn't just a bystander. "They're connected to this," Willowshade murmured, her eyes narrowing as she studied the figure. "They're not just watching, they're waiting." For a long moment no one spoke. The group stood in silence, the weight of what they had discovered settling over them like a heavy fog. The drained lake, the twisted tree, the bell holding the shard at bay, and the mysterious figure. It all felt like part of a puzzle they hadn't yet begun to understand. "What do we do now?" Finn asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Thornwhisker didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on the figure, his mind clearly working through the possibilities. After a long, tense silence, he finally spoke. "We find out who that is," he said, his voice grim. "And what they're doing with that bell." The stone outlook felt like a refuge, high above the eerie valley below. But the strange sight of the drained lake, the twisted tree, and the bell weighed heavily on the group. The purple shard, crackling with dangerous energy, hung suspended in mid-air, just inches from striking the side of the ornate bell. Even from this distance, the shard's electric glow flickered ominously, as though it was straining against the power that held it back. And then there was the figure, standing near the bell, unmoving, cloaked in shadow. Whoever they were, they had been waiting for something, or someone. A silence fell over the group as they stared down at the scene, each of them processing what they were seeing. The air around them buzzed faintly with the sound of the resonance, but Finn noticed something else, a slight unevenness in the hum. The bell's tone was no longer steady. Its power was weakening. Thornwhisker was the first to break the silence, his voice gruff and decisive. "We've seen enough. Whatever this is, it's beyond us right now. We fall back. We need to regroup, get more information before we act." Finn felt a flicker of relief at the suggestion. The air around them felt charged, heavy with anticipation, and every instinct told him that they weren't ready to face whatever was happening down there. He nodded in agreement, as did Brightpaw, who kept his eyes locked on the distant figure, his usual confidence replaced by caution. But Willowshade, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the outlook, studying the valley below, finally spoke. Her voice was soft but urgent, her brow furrowed with concern. Wait. The others turned to look at her, and she continued, her gaze still fixed on the bell and the shard. The bell. It's failing, she said, her voice low but certain. Can't you feel it? Finn blinked, suddenly more aware of the uneven hum vibrating through the air. It wasn't steady anymore. The resonance, once constant, was faltering, growing weaker with each passing second. Willowshade's expression darkened as she looked at them. The resonance is what's holding the shard back. If it stops, if the bell loses its power, the shard will strike, Thornwhisker finished grimly, his jaw tightening. They all understood what that meant. Whatever power was contained within the shard, it was dangerous. Dangerous enough that it had to be held back by the constant hum of the bell. If the resonance failed, if the shard broke free, there was no telling what kind of destruction it would unleash. Lyric, usually quick to offer some kind of plan or strategy, remained strangely silent, his amber eyes distant, as he stared down at the figure near the bell. Finn glanced at him, feeling the tension in the air shift. Lyric had been quiet the whole time, and while it wasn't unusual for him to get lost in thought, something about the way he was watching the scene below made Finn uneasy. Was he afraid? Then we really need to leave, Brightpaw said, though his voice wavered slightly. If the shard breaks free, we don't want to be anywhere near it. I agree, Thornwhisker added. We need to get out of here before this thing blows. But Willowshade shook her head slowly. If we leave now, she murmured, there might not be anything left to come back to. The bell won't hold much longer. If that shard hits... She trailed off, but they all knew what she meant. The consequences would be catastrophic. For a moment, the group was silent. Finn could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on them, the uncertainty pulling them in different directions. Retreat was the safer option, sensible, cautious. But leaving meant they would lose control of whatever was about to happen. Thornwhisker, always the leader, exhaled sharply and turned to the group. We're not equipped for this. We can't risk going down there without knowing what we're dealing with. Finn looked at the others, hoping for a sign of certainty. Brightpaw seemed eager to retreat, his eyes darting between the path and the scene below. Willowshade, however, remained quiet, her face tight with worry. She wasn't convinced. But Lyric, standing apart from the group, his eyes locked on the figure below, seemed to be wrestling with something deeper. His face was pale, and for a brief moment, Finn thought he saw a flicker of recognition in Lyric's eyes as he looked at the figure near the bell. Before Finn could ask him what he was thinking, Thornwhisker made the call. We're leaving. Let's get moving. The decision hung in the air, but the group began to prepare. Lyric broke from his trance and adjusted his lute, while Willowshade, though hesitant, nodded in agreement. Finn's heart raced as he pulled his camouflaging cloak tighter around his shoulders. The sooner they left, the better. As they gathered and prepared to cast the silence spell once again, Thornwhisker stepped toward the edge of the outlook, his amber eyes scanning the path they had taken up. Brightpaw, he said in a low voice, lead us back. The quicker, the better. Brightpaw gave a small nod, though there was no trace of his usual grin. The tension was thick in the air, the urgency growing as they prepared to make their retreat. With a final glance toward the lake and the bell below, the group turned and began to walk back into the forest, the spell of silence settling over them once again. But just as they stepped into the shadow of the trees, Brightpaw froze. His sharp eyes narrowed, his ears twitching, and he raised a hand to signal the others to stop. Finn's heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively reached for the small knife at his belt. There was a stillness ahead of them, a strange, oppressive quiet that had nothing to do with their spell. Finn squinted, trying to see what had made Brightpaw stop, and then, through the trees, he saw them. Wolves. A pack of them, standing in the path ahead, their eyes glowing faintly in the shadows. They were silent, their bodies tense, their yellow eyes locked onto the group with an eerie, unsettling focus. There was no growling, no sound of snarling teeth, just the wolves, waiting. Finn's pulse quickened as he realized what this meant. Their retreat was cut off. The way back was blocked. They're waiting for us, Willowshade whispered, her voice barely audible as they made it back to the safety of the outlook. Finn's heart pounded in his chest. The wolves stood completely still, as though they had been there all along, watching, waiting for the group to make their decision. There was no escape this way. Thornwhisker cursed under his breath, his hand tightening on the hilt of his sword. "We can't go back," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "The only way is forward." They had no choice now. The wolves weren't moving, but they were too many to fight through, too dangerous to outrun. The valley below, the bell, the shard, the figure, they were the only way out. Brightpaw took a step back, his jaw clenched, his eyes flicking nervously between the wolves and the path forward. "I don't like this," he whispered. Neither did Finn. The wolves remained silent, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. There was something more to them, something that felt tied to the resonance, to the bell and the shard. They weren't just ordinary wolves. "They're not going to let us leave," Willowshade said softly, her voice filled with quiet dread. "Not without facing what's down there." Thornwhisker exhaled sharply, turning back to the group, his face hard with determination. "We have no choice. We go down. We deal with whatever this is, and we get through it." Finn swallowed hard, his heart racing. His gaze flicked once more to Lyric, who remained quiet but determined, his face still pale, his eyes dark with something that Finn couldn't quite read. Without another word, they turned back toward the lake. The wolves held their ground, unmoving, watching as the group made their decision. The only way for them to go now was forward.